Welcome back. Today, we are diving straight into a really fascinating and incredibly viral piece of political commentary. We're looking at a source that takes this massive Unite the Kingdom protest over in London and uses it to make these huge, sweeping, civilizational claims about the West. Now, regardless of where you personally fall on the political spectrum, understanding exactly how these giant media narratives are constructed, it's absolutely crucial. So let's just map out this commentator's worldview step by step.
Here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at framing the protest. Second, characterizing the Prime Minister. Third, defining Western identity. And finally, we'll wrap up with transatlantic parallels.
All right, Section 1, Framing the London Protest, focusing on claims of scale and media bias. Right out of the gate, our source sets the scene by really emphasizing the sheer size of this crowd, and they explicitly position their coverage directly against mainstream reporting.
What's really interesting here is how the commentator uses crowd size. It's not just a passing fact, it's used as a direct metric of truth. They highlight this super stark contrast. While legacy media is out there reporting that tens of thousands of people descended on London, our source pushes back hard. They literally tell their audience, don't let them lie to you, insisting that there are actually millions of people marching. For them, this massive scale is basically undeniable proof of a suppressed majority.
And this idea is totally cemented by their specific word choice. The commentator states, legacy media are squirming as they watch millions of Brits march towards Parliament Square. This is what a revolution looks like. Just notice that framing for a second. The word squirming really implies that the media is terrified of the reality on the ground, right? And using the word revolution, well, that elevates this whole thing from a standard political march into a historic uprising. It's a very triumphant tone specifically designed to validate the viewers who support the march.
Moving on to Section 2, characterizing the Prime Minister and looking at the grievances against leadership. Because, well, every massive protest needs an antagonist, right? The source directs some really relentless criticism squarely at UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer.
The source lays out a highly charged list of grievances here. They label Starmer a far left-wing socialist and claim he's the most unpopular prime minister in English history. They also accuse his administration of a massive double standard. They claim he blocks visas for conservative speakers who are trying to keep England Christian, while at the exact same time allowing what the source very controversially calls parasitic populations to exploit the welfare state. And finally, they argue that when the prime minister talks about banning hateful demonstrations, well, he's really just using that as an excuse to stifle Christian voices.
This perfectly illustrates the contrast framing that the source leans heavily on. By directly quoting Starmer's pledge to stop far-right agitators from spreading hatred, the commentator is setting up this crystal-clear binary opposition. It gives the audience a very specific enemy to react against.
And then, the source explicitly flips the script. Where the government sees far-right agitators, the commentator insists, no, these marchers are actually patriots who love their country. They reframe the entire event as a movement of regular people who just want to make England great again. It is a complete 180-degree inversion of the mainstream political narrative.
Okay, Section 3, Defining Western Identity, the Ideological Core. Here, the commentary zooms way out. It goes far beyond just local UK politics or immigration policy and attempts to establish a very strict traditional definition of Western civilization itself.
The commentator hits the audience with these massive, totally existential rhetorical questions. They ask, what is an American? What is the West? What is an Englishman? By asking these really big-picture questions, the host elevates this London protest from, just a weekend rally over specific policies straight into a generational, civilizational struggle for identity.
But they don't just leave you hanging with the questions. They provide a very definitive answer. The commentator explicitly ties the entire foundation of the West directly to Christendom. They argue that things like jurisprudence, the justice system, and basic rights like free speech, they claim all of that stems directly and entirely from Christian principles. To really solidify this definition, they draw a stark cultural boundary. They frame Western Christian principles as the sole origin of free speech and freedom of religion. And then they contrast this directly against Muslim countries and Sharia law, asserting that those societies inherently lack these fundamental freedoms. So, they use this stark contrast to build their argument that importing populations from these regions directly threatens the constitutional rights of the native population.
And this right here brings us to the absolute ideological core of the commentary. The host states, if there's no more Western European Christians in the West, is it the West anymore? No, it's not fundamentally. Think about the scale of that argument for a second. They're saying that demographic shifts don't just change a culture over time. In this specific worldview, those shifts fundamentally erase the nation entirely and erase the West as a concept. Finally, we arrive at Section 4, Transatlantic Populist Connections, tying the UK events to MAGA. After establishing those incredibly high stakes, the source seamlessly merges this UK-centric protest into one massive, global narrative.
The source actively maps the sentiments of these UK marchers directly onto the American MAGA movement. It's almost a one-to-one comparison for them. When the British crowd chants, "We want our country back," the commentator points out how that perfectly echoes Donald Trump. When they talk about rejecting 60 years of demoralization, well, that maps right onto the America First ideology. According to the source, both of these movements share one cohesive goal: prioritizing the native population. It is framed as a single, shared ideology that completely spans the Atlantic.
Now, what's genuinely fascinating here is this rare moment of concession. The commentator, who is a self-described proud American who always wants to be number one, actually openly admits that the scale of this London march absolutely dwarfs typical MAGA rallies. He notes that while U.S. stadium rallies might pull in, say, 10 or 20,000 people, these London streets are seeing crowds 5 to 10 times that size. You can actually hear him marveling at it, admitting that it's been a really long time since he's seen a march this massive for their cause back in America.
Which leads us right to the ultimate synthesis of this whole message. The commentator declares, this is going to be the cry of the West after 60 years of demoralization. This is also what the MAGA movement stands for. By completely merging the Unite the Kingdom march with the MAGA movement, the source is confirming a deliberate cross-border alignment. They are no longer just reporting on a local British protest. They are actively signaling a unified, international populist awakening.
So that leaves us with a really vital question to consider. As these massive interconnected media narratives continue to scale up and cross borders, completely blending local grievances with these grand civilizational narratives, how is this shared transatlantic populist rhetoric going to influence the future of Western elections and political discourse? I mean, the messaging here is highly organized, it's deeply ideological, and as we've clearly seen today, it's very well defined. Thank you so much for joining me to unpack all of this. Always keep questioning the media you consume, and I'll see you in the next explainer.